In the early evening hours of December 24th, 2011, a young woman named Giselle Preston sat on her bed in her small, quiet apartment in Anaheim, California. The holiday season was in full swing, and outside, the cool winter air was filled with the sounds of neighbors laughing, music playing, and the general excitement of Christmas Eve. Giselle was 26 years old, and she had always dreamed of building a beautiful, peaceful life for her young children. On this night, she was focused on a single, joyful task: wrapping Christmas gifts for her family. She wanted everything to be absolutely perfect for them when they woke up the next morning to celebrate. Laying right next to her on the bed was her newest addition to the family, her third child, a beautiful 7-week-old baby boy. As Giselle carefully cut the bright wrapping paper, taped the edges, and wrote out the labels, she would occasionally look down at her sleeping son and smile. This Christmas was a very big deal for Giselle. She felt a profound sense of hope and relief that she had not felt in a long time. It was also an incredibly big deal for her husband, 30-year-old William Wallace. This was not only because it was going to be their first Christmas with their newborn son, but also because this was the first holiday season after Giselle and William had officially reconciled their relationship. You see, they had been married for the past 3 years, but over those 3 years, their relationship had been incredibly unhealthy, toxic, and at times severely physically abusive. They had been trapped in a cycle of shouting matches, doors slamming, and violent confrontations that often left both of them feeling exhausted and miserable. But earlier that year, when Giselle discovered she was pregnant with their third child, something shifted. This new baby became a fresh anchor point for their relationship. It was as if, suddenly, they could both agree to put their deep-seated differences and anger aside. They resolved to focus entirely on raising their children together in a peaceful, loving home. After wrapping her final present, Giselle hopped off the bed. She gently scooped up her sleeping baby boy, cradled him in her arms, and headed out into the warm living room. There, she met up with her husband, William, and her 2 older children, who were little girls aged 3 and 8. The family put on their jackets and headed outside into the cool evening. They walked next door to celebrate Christmas Eve at a festive party with their neighbors. At the party, Giselle was seen smiling, laughing, and enjoying the holiday spirit. She seemed completely happy, and neighbors noted that she and William appeared to be getting along wonderfully. It seemed like their reconciliation was actually working, and the dark days of their abusive past were finally behind them. But the problem was, once the party ended and the family walked back to their own apartment, the fragile peace they had built completely shattered. Almost as soon as they stepped through their front door, a vicious argument broke out between Giselle and William. By the time the children were put to bed in their rooms, the fight between the parents had escalated from screaming to extreme physical violence. Late that night, neighbors in the apartment complex would recall hearing a loud, terrifying commotion coming from Giselle and William's apartment. There were heavy thudding sounds, things crashing to the floor, and desperate screams. At one point in the night, Giselle apparently tried to run out of the front door to escape the apartment, but William chased her down, grabbed her, and violently hauled her back inside, slamming the door behind them. The sounds of struggle and crying coming from the apartment would eventually fade away, stopping completely in the wee hours of Christmas Day. As the sun came up on Christmas Day, the 2 oldest daughters got up early, filled with the pure excitement that only children feel on Christmas morning. They rushed out of their bedrooms, ran down the hallway, and bounded into the living room, ready to see what Santa had left for them. The living room was completely decked out with Christmas decorations that the family had put up over the past couple of weeks. The Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with bright, multicolored lights and glittering ornaments. There were festive wreaths on the wall, and string lights cast a warm glow around the top of the room. Over their fireplace, their stockings were nailed up, stuffed to the brim with holiday goodies. On the couch sat William and Giselle, along with their 7-week-old baby brother. The little girls squealed with delight and ran around the couch, taking up spots right underneath the Christmas tree. They grabbed their very first presents and turned to look at their parents on the couch. They saw their dad, William, give them a slow nod of approval, which meant they had permission to start opening their gifts. And so, the girls happily began tearing into the festive wrapping paper, laughing and showing off their brand new toys. After each of them had a new toy in hand, they turned around reflexively to show their parents, wanting to share their excitement. William looked at the toys and said they were great. But when the girls looked at their mother to show her, Giselle did not react at all. She completely ignored them. She did not look at the toys, she did not smile, and she did not say a single word. At some point, the girls started calling out to her, asking her to look at their new things. But Giselle just sat there, leaning back on the couch, completely silent and still. She was wearing a pair of dark sunglasses, and she was positioned in a way that made her look like she was just resting or ignoring them. Finally, the 8-year-old girl turned to William and asked what was wrong with Mommy. William paused, and then he gave Giselle a cold, scathing look before very bluntly saying to his young daughters that Mommy got drunk and now she had ruined Christmas. The girls knew from William's harsh tone of voice that their parents must be having another one of their fights. And so, they did what they normally did when this happened, which was to just try to ignore the tension. They turned away from their parents and began opening more presents, doing their absolute best not to disturb their mother and father, who were sitting silently behind them on the couch. But at around 9 a.m., after most of the presents had been opened, William abruptly stood up and walked into the other room. He picked up the phone and placed a call. And then, a few minutes later, there was a loud, urgent knock on the front door. It turns out that the night before, after they returned from the neighbor's party, William had beaten Giselle to death. The physical confrontation had been brutal, and by the time the struggle ended, Giselle was dead. Instead of calling for help or trying to save her, William had dragged her body into the living room. He sat her up on the couch, arranging her limbs to make it look like she was sitting naturally. He then placed a pair of dark sunglasses over her eyes in order to hide the severe bruising and swelling on her face, hoping to trick the young children. And so, all morning, as the 3-year-old and 8-year-old girls opened their Christmas gifts and turned to show their mother with excitement, she was actually dead the whole time. William had sat right next to her corpse, watching his daughters open their presents, participating in a sick charade. But by 9 a.m., William realized his cover story was not going to last because his children were becoming increasingly suspicious of their mother's complete lack of movement and response. And so he called 911 and told the dispatcher that his wife had drank too much, tripped, and fallen into a glass coffee table, injuring herself. When the police and paramedics arrived at the apartment, they went inside and immediately realized that William was lying. Giselle had severe injuries that could not have been caused by a simple fall. There was no broken glass coffee table, and the physical state of her body made it clear that she had been dead for many hours, long before the children woke up. William was arrested on the spot and charged with her murder. Ultimately, William Wallace would go on trial, where the prosecution detailed the horrific nature of the crime and the psychological trauma inflicted on the children. He was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. As for Giselle's 3 children, they were taken in by her grieving parents, who did their best to provide them with a safe, loving environment far away from the shadow of that terrible Christmas morning. Now we are going to travel to another part of California, but this time we are going to go back in time to the year 1848 during the famous California Gold Rush. During this historic period, hundreds of thousands of Americans living on the east coast of the United States packed up all of their earthly possessions into covered wagons and headed west across the rugged continent, attempting to quite literally strike gold. About a year after the rush started, in the winter of 1849, a group of about 100 gold prospectors was making its way across the vast, barren interior of the country. They got completely lost in a totally empty, desolate stretch of desert. Roughly 500 miles away from their ultimate destination of San Francisco, these pioneers would spend the next 2 months driving their wagons around this scorching, dry desert, desperately searching for a way out, but they could not find any exit. The heat was oppressive, their resources were nearly gone, and the environment was incredibly hostile. Finally, realizing they were trapped, they stopped, set up camp, and essentially waited to die. But as a last-ditch effort, they decided to send 2 of their fittest, healthiest men ahead on foot to try to find help. Against all odds, those 2 men actually managed to find assistance. It was not long before the lost pioneers were being guided up and over a mountain pass, out of the grueling desert, and to safety. As the pioneers were cresting the top of the mountain, looking back down at the vast, desolate valley below where they had almost all perished, one of them turned and famously said, "Goodbye, Death Valley." And the name stuck. While Death Valley has since become a very popular tourist destination for adventurous travelers, hikers, and campers, it remains one of the harshest and most dangerous environments on the planet. It is a vast, open desert that presents a whole host of deadly challenges to any mammal trying to survive there. During the summer months, Death Valley becomes one of the hottest places on Earth. The temperatures routinely soar to 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and on some occasions, they have gone as high as 136 degrees. It is the kind of place where if you do not respect the environment and prepare properly, it will kill you. In the year 2005, a 35-year-old man named Robert Dammer, who lived in the bustling city of Los Angeles, California, decided he wanted to take a solo trip into Death Valley. Specifically, Robert wanted to travel to the hot springs located in the far northwest corner of the park. Right around those natural hot springs, there was a well-known nudist resort, and Robert was very interested in checking out that unique scene. And so, on July 26th of that year, Robert loaded up his trusty Volkswagen van, left the city of Los Angeles, and drove north for about 4 hours until he reached the small mountain town of Bishop, California, where some of his family members lived. He spent the night catching up with his family, and the next morning he got back into his van, filled with excitement for his adventure. He drove south for about 20 minutes to a tiny town called Zurich, California, where he officially picked up Death Valley Road, This particular road covers the entire length of Death Valley, starting from its northern entrance, where Robert was, and running south for 140 miles to the southern entrance. The road itself is basically a long, straight line, but off of this main paved road, there are literally hundreds of miles of unpaved dirt roads that splinter off in all directions across the vast desert. These dirt roads are what travelers use to reach various points of interest, including the hot springs and the nudist resort that Robert was heading toward. After Robert entered Death Valley Road at the northern entrance, he drove south for about an hour, keeping a close eye out for the turnoff that would lead him down the unpaved road toward his destination. He knew this dirt road would take him the final 50 miles across the desert to the resort. Eventually, Robert saw a turnoff that he believed was the correct unpaved road. He turned his Volkswagen van onto the dirt track and began driving, but all of a sudden, the ground beneath him gave way and his van sank deep into the earth. No matter how much he pressed on the gas, the tires just spun and the vehicle would not budge. It turns out that Robert had made a critical mistake. He had not turned onto the correct unpaved road. Instead, he had accidentally chosen a dirt track that led directly out onto a salt flat. To the naked eye, the salt flat looked completely flat, dry, and hard-packed, making it seem like you could easily drive or walk across it. But in reality, the white surface of a salt flat is very thin and brittle. Underneath that crust is a deep, thick layer of wet mud. Before Robert even realized what was happening, his heavy van had broken through the thin surface crust and was hopelessly stuck in the thick mud below. After trying unsuccessfully to dig his van out, Robert realized he was in a very dangerous situation. His cell phone had absolutely no reception, meaning he could not call anyone for help. He was also far too deep in the desert to even attempt to walk to the nearest town or ranger station. Luckily, Robert was a prepared traveler, and he had packed a large supply of fresh water in his van. And so, he decided the smartest thing he could do was to stay with his vehicle, carefully ration his water supply, and wait for another traveler on Death Valley Road to spot his stuck van and come to his rescue. But after waiting for 6 long days in the sweltering heat, no one came. No one on the main road had looked out into the distance and noticed his van. Robert's water supply was nearly gone, and he knew that if he stayed there any longer, he would die of dehydration. And so, out of pure desperation, Robert decided his only option was to abandon his van and try to walk back to civilization. He packed up every drop of water he had left, threw it on his back, and began his march across the scorching desert. Just like the lost pioneers of 1849, Robert was rescued at the absolute last second. As he was stumbling across the hot sand, his water canteen completely empty and his body failing, a vehicle appeared. It turned out that a group of teenage boys and a few adults who were part of an organization called the League of Venturers were out in Death Valley that day. They were conducting search and rescue training exercises, and by sheer coincidence, they decided to turn onto the exact same unpaved road that Robert had gotten stuck on. They saw Robert stumbling through the heat and immediately rushed to help him. When Robert saw them, he broke down, crying tears of joy because he knew he was facing certain death that very day. The rescuers took Robert into their air-conditioned van, gave him water, and drove him 80 miles to the nearest ranger station. As soon as Robert stepped out of the vehicle at the station, he dropped to his knees and literally kissed the ground in appreciation. He was profoundly grateful to be alive. That evening, Robert was able to hitch a ride from the ranger station back to the town of Bishop, where his family was. The next morning, he contacted a local towing company and they agreed to drive him back out into Death Valley to locate his van and tow it back to town. But when they finally reached the vehicle, the tow truck operators looked at the van and shook their heads. The van was in terrible shape. It had 2 flat tires, and there were several other serious mechanical issues that had to be fixed before it could be safely towed out of the mud. They told Robert they could not tow it today, and they drove him back to Bishop. Robert, who was very handy and liked working on his van, decided he would just make the necessary repairs himself. He spent the day going around town gathering up all the tools, spare parts, and supplies he would need. That evening, he convinced a young local couple to give him a ride back into Death Valley so he could get to work. Robert told his family that his plan was to go to the van, make the repairs, spend the night there, and then contact the towing company the next morning to finally bring the van home. But that night, Robert did not return to Bishop, and by the next morning, his family had still not heard from him. Sensing something was terribly wrong, they contacted the authorities. It would take a few days, but searchers would eventually piece together the tragic story of what happened to Robert. The young couple who had agreed to drive him back into the desert had dropped him off at an intersection off of Death Valley Road. Both Robert and the couple believed this intersection was only about a mile away from the nudist resort. Robert told them he would just walk the short distance to the resort, find someone there with a vehicle to drive him the rest of the way to his van, and then he would fix it. He waved goodbye to the couple as they drove away into the night, stashed his heavy repair supplies by the road, and began walking. But the problem was Robert was dropped off at the wrong intersection. He was not a mile away from the resort. He was actually 15 miles away, and the unpaved road he was walking on was extremely winding and confusing. Even if he had known the actual distance, he would not have been able to navigate it in the dark without a map. Robert walked down the dusty road for about 10 miles, getting more and more lost and dehydrated. In his confusion, he eventually left the dirt road and started walking out into the open, trackless desert, likely desperately searching for any sign of water or shelter. The extreme summer heat quickly overwhelmed him. Robert collapsed and died in the desert just 4 days after he had been miraculously rescued from the exact same deadly situation. When searchers finally discovered his body, they found that he had gone into the wilderness without a GPS, without a map, and without even a simple container of water. Now we are going to travel across the globe to the beautiful, rugged country of New Zealand. In late 2002, a 25-year-old man named Jason Chase was living in an area called Gisborne, which is located in the northeastern section of the country. Jason was a hard-working young man who made his living as a sheep shearer, which is a very physically demanding job. When Jason was not working, he spent almost all of his free time on his bicycle. He was an avid cyclist who loved riding up and down the scenic, winding coastal roads, constantly training and preparing for his next competitive road race. In early December of that year, Jason contacted his family, who lived in a small, quiet town called Dannevirke, located about 200 miles southwest of Gisborne. He told them that he wanted to come visit them for the upcoming Christmas holidays. However, because his work schedule was so busy and his training routine was so demanding, he could not tell them exactly what day he would arrive. He told them not to worry and promised he would be at their house either on Christmas Day, December 25th, or perhaps a few days earlier. His family was absolutely thrilled, and they told him they could not wait to see him, no matter when he showed up. And so, as the middle of December rolled around and Jason had still not arrived at his family's home in Dannevirke, no one was worried. They assumed he was just finishing up his sheep shearing work and getting in some final training rides before making the journey south. But on December 13th, everything changed. On that day, a local hunter was driving his truck along one of the many winding back roads that cut through the Ruahine mountain range. This mountain range, which is located about 8 miles north of the town of Dannevirke, is an incredibly isolated and rugged wilderness area. It is characterized by steep gorges, deep gullies, and very thick, dense brush that is difficult to navigate. As the hunter rounded a sharp turn on the empty dirt road, he looked up ahead and saw a car parked on the gravel shoulder. The hunter pulled up alongside the vehicle and looked inside. The car was completely empty, and there was no obvious damage to the exterior. The hunter got out and scanned the surrounding area, looking for any sign of the driver, but all he saw was the thick, dense forest lining the road. The mountain slope dropped off steeply on one side of the road, and there was nothing unique or interesting about this particular spot that would cause someone to park their car there. Something about the scene just felt incredibly odd to the hunter. The car seemed completely out of place in such a remote area. Operating on a strong hunch, the hunter drove back down the mountain and into the town of Dannevirke. He stopped at the local police station and told the officers about the strange parked car he had found up in the Ruahine range. He figured that perhaps someone had been reported missing, or maybe the car had been stolen and abandoned. At the time, the police did not have any reports of missing persons that matched the description of the car. But just to be thorough, a couple of officers hopped into their patrol cars and drove up into the mountains to investigate. Sure enough, they found the vehicle parked exactly where the hunter had said. They inspected the car and confirmed that it was locked, undamaged, and when they peered through the window, they saw that the gas gauge was completely full. The police walked around the immediate area, calling out, but they found no one. They took down the license plate number and headed back to the station. When they ran the plate, they discovered that the vehicle belonged to Jason Chase. The police immediately contacted Jason's family and asked them why Jason's car would be parked in a remote mountain range north of town. His family was incredibly surprised and confused. They explained that Jason was supposed to be driving down from Gisborne to visit them, and while the mountains were close to their house, it made absolutely no sense for him to park his car and wander into the rugged wilderness. Sensing that something was wrong, the police organized an official search and rescue operation. Over the next several days, hundreds of volunteers, police officers, and search dogs combed the thick brush of the Ruahine range. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew over the steep ridges, searching for any sign of the young man. But despite their best efforts, they found absolutely nothing. No clothing, no footprints, and no equipment. With Christmas quickly approaching, the official search was reluctantly called off, leaving Jason's family devastated. But Jason's family and close friends refused to give up. They decided to organize their own private search parties to keep looking for him. On January 3rd, a family friend who owned a small private airplane agreed to fly over the foothills of the mountain range to see if he could spot anything from the air. As the pilot made a low pass over a remote section of the mountains, he looked down and noticed a bright red speck in the middle of a wide, dry riverbed. The red object stood out sharply against the gray gravel of the riverbed, but from the air, the pilot could not tell exactly what it was. He noted the coordinates and immediately passed them along to the search parties on the ground. The ground team set out toward the coordinates. They had to hike through incredibly thick brush and scramble down several steep, dangerous slopes before they finally reached the edge of the dry riverbed. And there, right in the middle of the gravel clearing, they saw the bright red object. It was a red shirt, and Jason Chase was still wearing it. Jason was found lying on his left side with his legs stretched out. He was wearing his bright red rugby t-shirt and a pair of khaki shorts, but he had no shoes or socks on. He was completely barefoot. The searchers who first approached him noted that the scene looked incredibly peaceful, as if Jason had simply laid down in the middle of the riverbed to take a nap. But Jason was not asleep. He was dead, there were no visible injuries on his body, and there were no signs of a struggle in the gravel around him. His clothing was completely clean and pristine, which was highly unusual for someone who had supposedly been lost in the rugged wilderness for weeks. Furthermore, despite being barefoot, his feet were in remarkably good condition, showing no cuts, scrapes, or bruises. Searchers looked everywhere in the area for his shoes and socks, but they were never found. The only object near his body was his plastic water bottle. An autopsy was performed to determine what had killed the healthy, athletic young cyclist. But the results only deepened the mystery. The pathologist could find no physical injuries, no signs of disease, and no evidence of violence. Jason appeared to be well nourished, as there was still food in his stomach and he was fully hydrated with urine present in his bladder. The toxicology report came back completely clean, showing no traces of drugs, alcohol, prescription medications, or any common poisons. The only unusual thing the pathologist discovered during the autopsies was two very small, superficial ulcers in Jason's duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. The pathologist knew that these specific types of ulcers, known as stress ulcers, only develop during moments of extreme, acute physical stress right before death. Usually, they are caused by a catastrophic injury, severe blood loss, or blood poisoning. But Jason had none of those things. In the end, the pathologist had to conclude that Jason had not been murdered, he had not committed suicide, and he had died from obscure natural causes. The pathologist was also able to determine that Jason had died on or around December 30th. This meant that while hundreds of people and helicopters were actively searching for him up in the mountains, Jason was alive. He had survived in the wilderness for over 2 weeks, only to die right after the official search was called off. With no evidence of foul play, the case was officially closed, and his grieving family was left with a mountain of unanswered questions, fast forward 15 years. The very same pathologist who had conducted Jason's autopsy was having a casual conversation with a medical colleague. They began talking about unusual and unsolved cases, and the pathologist brought up the mysterious death of Jason Chase. He described how the young, healthy man had been found lying dead in a dry riverbed in the Ruahine Mountains, barefoot, with no injuries, and with those strange stress ulcers in his intestine. The colleague listened intently, and suddenly he stopped the pathologist and asked him exactly which gully Jason had walked down to reach the riverbed. The pathologist explained the location, and the colleague's eyes went wide. He told the pathologist that he was almost certain he knew exactly what had killed Jason Chase. The following is a reconstruction of what actually happened to Jason on those final days. On December 13, 2002, Jason left his home in Gisborne and drove south toward his family's home. But along the way, he decided to take a detour up into the Ruahine mountain range. He parked his car on the side of the road, grabbed his backpack, his sleeping bag, and his water bottle, and walked into the dense forest. For reasons we will never know, Jason had decided to go on a solo camping trip in the mountains before heading to his family's house for Christmas. He set up a campsite deep in the woods and spent the next several days enjoying the wilderness. Because the forest was so dense and the terrain was so rugged, Jason never saw or heard any of the search parties or helicopters that were looking for him. To him, everything was perfectly fine. He was just camping. But around Christmas Day, when it was time for him to pack up his gear and hike back up to his car so he could drive to his family's house, Jason realized he was in trouble. He could not find his way back up the steep mountain slope to the road where his car was parked. Perhaps there was a physical barrier, or perhaps he had simply lost his bearings. Being in peak physical shape, Jason did not panic. He decided that instead of trying to climb back up, he would simply hike down the mountain following the natural paths until he reached the valley below. He knew the town of Dannevirke was only about 8 miles away, and he could easily walk that distance, find help, and get a ride back to his car. As he began his hike down the mountain, Jason made some unusual decisions. At some point, he abandoned his heavy backpack and sleeping bag. He also removed his shoes and socks, perhaps because his feet were blistered or because he had to cross wet terrain. By December 30th, Jason was very close to safety. He just had to navigate one final steep section of the mountain to reach the flat, dry riverbed, which would lead him straight out of the wilderness. Jason stood at the top of a ridge, looking down at two steep gullies that both led down to the riverbed. Both options would get him to where he wanted to go, so it was just a matter of choosing which path looked safer and easier to climb down. Jason made his choice, stepped into the gully, and began sliding and scrambling down the steep dirt slope. But as soon as he reached the bottom and stepped onto the flat stones of the dry riverbed, Jason felt a sudden sharp pain in his stomach. The pain quickly became incredibly intense, causing him to double over. He sat down on the gravel, hoping the pain would pass, but it only got worse. Within minutes, his vision began to blur and he found himself gasping for air. Before he could even understand what was happening to his body, a wave of paralysis swept through his limbs. He lost the ability to move, slumped over onto his left side, and lay there, completely paralyzed, until his heart stopped and he died. It turns out that the gully Jason had chosen to slide down was filled with a native New Zealand plant called Urtica ferox, commonly known as onga onga or the tree nettle. This plant grows in dense thickets and is covered in thousands of tiny, rigid, needle-like hairs. When a person brushed against the plant, these hairs act like hypodermic needles, injecting a powerful neurotoxin called trifidin directly into the skin. Because Jason was wearing shorts and was completely barefoot, his exposed legs and feet brushed against dozens of these plants as he slid down the steep gully. He was injected with a massive, lethal dose of the toxin. The trifidin quickly entered his bloodstream, causing acute physical stress, which explained the sudden development of the stress ulcers in his intestine. The toxin then attacked his nervous system, causing rapid paralysis and respiratory failure. The reason the pathologist had missed this during the autopsy was because the tiny stinger marks left by the plant are practically invisible on human skin once a person has died. Furthermore, trifidin is such an extremely rare and specific toxin that it is never included in standard toxicology screens. After his colleague pointed this out, investigators returned to the exact gully where Jason had descended to the riverbed. Sure enough, the gully was completely choked with massive, thick patches of Urtica ferox. Jason, a healthy young man, had been killed in a matter of minutes by a plant he had simply failed to notice in the dense brush. Now we are going to travel back in time to the year 1949. To the busy, fog-covered streets of London, England. The crime that would eventually put a young man named Timothy Evans on death row was absolutely horrific, sending shockwaves through the entire country. But when you take a close look at Timothy's past and the incredibly difficult life he had lived, it is not really a surprise that his life played out in such a tragic, chaotic way. Timothy was born in 1924 in the southern end of Wales. Before he was even born, his father had completely abandoned the family, leaving Timothy's mother to raise several children on her own with almost no income. As a result, Timothy was born into extreme, grinding poverty. As a young child, Timothy struggled immensely. He had a severe speech impediment and found it very difficult to learn how to speak properly, which made him a target for bullies. When he started school, he struggled to keep up with his classmates, finding it nearly impossible to grasp basic reading and writing. To make his life even more difficult, when Timothy was just 8 years old, he contracted a terrible condition called tuberculosis of the skin on the underside of his right foot. This condition caused large, incredibly painful blisters that would rupture and take months to heal, even with medical treatment. Because the outbreak was on the bottom of his foot, walking was nearly impossible for him. For several years, Timothy had to miss massive chunks of his schooling. Sometimes he was in the hospital getting painful treatments, and other times he was simply stuck at home because he could not physically walk to school. Given how much he was already struggling academically, these long absences were completely catastrophic for his education. In fact, later in his life, doctors would officially test Timothy's IQ and find that it was somewhere between 60 and 70. This extremely low score put him well within the range of having a significant intellectual disability. He was completely illiterate, unable to read or write even his own name. Despite his physical and mental limitations, Timothy eventually left school because his family desperately needed money. He was willing to do any kind of hard manual labor to help his mother. When he was only 13 years old, he got a job working as a coal miner, which was one of the most dangerous, brutal jobs imaginable. But Timothy could never hold down a job for long. Either he would have a sudden, painful flare-up of the tuberculosis on his foot, making him unable to walk to work, or his employers would discover that he was completely illiterate and could not read basic instructions, leading them to fire him. When World War II broke out and all of his peers went off to fight, Timothy tried to enlist in the military. But the army rejected him, telling him he was unfit to serve because of his foot and his inability to read. This constant, painful cycle of rejection and embarrassment made Timothy incredibly cynical and insecure. He felt like he did not belong anywhere and that everyone looked down on him. To cope with this deep sense of shame, Timothy began to lie. He became a compulsive liar, constantly making up elaborate, fantastic stories about his life. He would tell people that he had been on incredible adventures, that he was close friends with famous and powerful people, and that he possessed superhuman skills. Most people who knew Timothy easily saw through his lies and ignored him. But every now and then, someone would actually believe one of his stories. For Timothy, that tiny sliver of respect and attention was like a drug. It was the only time in his life he felt important, and so he became completely addicted to telling these tall tales. Fast forward to 1947. Timothy was 23 years old, and his family had moved from Wales to a very poor, rough neighborhood in London. Timothy had managed to get a job as a delivery truck driver, which he enjoyed because he did not need to read or write to drive a truck along a set route. One day, while making his deliveries, he met an 18-year-old girl named Beryl Thorley. Beryl, like Timothy, came from a poor background and was believed to have a very low intelligence. The two of them immediately hit it off, and by the end of that year, they were married. Initially, the newlyweds lived in a cramped room inside Timothy's family's apartment. But when Beryl became pregnant in early 1948, they decided they needed a place of their own. They pooled what little money they had and rented a tiny, run-down apartment on the top floor of a building at 10 Rillington Place. The apartment was awful. It was small, dirty, had no indoor toilet, and was located in a very dangerous, impoverished neighborhood. But to Timothy and Beryl, it was theirs. Once Beryl gave birth to their daughter, Geraldine, their lives became incredibly stressful. The tiny, cramped flat suddenly felt impossibly small for a family of three. They were already severely struggling to buy food, and now they had a baby to care for. Timothy tried desperately to find extra work, but his illiteracy and his bad foot always held him back. Soon, they were forced to take out high-interest loans from predatory lenders just to buy basic supplies. They were trapped in a mountain of debt they could never hope to pay back. The constant stress of poverty, debt, and parenthood quickly eroded their marriage. They began arguing daily over money, and these arguments soon escalated into violent physical fights. The walls of Rillington Place were paper-thin, and people walking on the busy street outside could often hear Timothy and Beryl screaming, throwing things, and hitting each other. Timothy's world was crumbling around him. At first, he turned to his old coping mechanism, telling anyone who would listen that his family was doing wonderfully and that he was making plenty of money. But when that failed to ease his pain, he turned to alcohol. Drinking only made things worse, as it drained their tiny budget and made Beryl even more furious with him. In his deepest misery, Timothy turned to a very unlikely source of comfort. His downstairs neighbor, a man named John Christie. John Christie was the absolute opposite of Timothy. He was nearly double Timothy's age, highly intelligent, articulate, and widely respected in the neighborhood. John was a veteran of World War I, having served on the front lines and survived a horrific mustard gas attack that had temporarily blinded him and left his voice permanently damaged to a soft whisper. After the war, John had served as a police constable during World War II and now worked as a respected clerk for the post office. He lived on the ground floor with his wife, Ethel. Hearing the violent fights coming from the top floor, John decided to reach out to Timothy. He offered him a sympathetic ear and some fatherly advice on how to handle his marital problems. Timothy, who had never had a father figure in his life, quickly grew to look up to John. He saw him as a brilliant, kind mentor. But this fragile support system shattered when Beryl discovered she was pregnant with their second child. This was devastating news. They were already starving, and another baby would completely ruin them. At the time, abortion was strictly illegal in the United Kingdom, carrying a sentence of life in prison. Desperate and terrified, Timothy went to John Christie for help. John listened to Timothy's panic, and then, in his quiet whisper, he told Timothy that he had extensive medical training from his time in the army. He told Timothy that he knew how to perform a safe, surgical abortion and offered to do it for Beryl to solve their problems. Timothy was incredibly relieved. He ran upstairs and told Beryl about John's offer. Beryl, equally desperate, agreed to the plan. A few days later, on November 8, 1949, John Christie told Timothy that he would perform the procedure that afternoon while Timothy was out on his delivery route. When Timothy returned home later that evening, he went straight to John's apartment to see how his wife was doing. John met him at the door with a grim expression. He whispered to Timothy that something had gone terribly wrong during the procedure. He said that Beryl had suffered a massive infection and died. Timothy was completely horrified and began to panic, but John, remaining perfectly calm, took control of the situation. He told Timothy that if they called the police, Timothy would be arrested for conspiracy to perform an illegal abortion and would go to prison for life. Leaving his baby daughter, Geraldine, with no parents, John told Timothy that he would handle disposing of Beryl's body and that he had arranged for a kind couple in the country to take care of baby Geraldine. He told Timothy that he needed to pack his bags and flee to Wales immediately to avoid suspicion. Confused, terrified, and trusting his mentor completely, Timothy did exactly what he was told. He fled to Wales, leaving his daughter in John's care, but over the next 3 weeks, Timothy was consumed by intense guilt and worry. He wanted to see his daughter, but whenever he tried to contact John, he got no answers. Finally, unable to bear the stress any longer, Timothy walked into a police station in Wales on November 30th. He told the officers that he wanted to confess to a crime. Because he was still trying to protect his friend John Christie, Timothy lied. He told the police that he had purchased a special abortion drug from a stranger, given it to his wife, and that it had killed her. He said that in a panic, he had stuffed her body down a large sewer drain outside their apartment building. The police immediately arrested Timothy and contacted the detectives in London. The London police went to Rillington Place and located the heavy manhole cover outside. It took 3 strong police officers to lift the heavy iron lid. When they went down into the sewer with flashlights, they found absolutely nothing. There was no body. When detectives confronted Timothy in his cell with this information, Timothy broke down. Realizing that John Christie must have lied to him, Timothy changed his story. He told the police the absolute truth. He explained that John Christie had offered to perform the abortion, that Beryl had died during it, and that John had supposedly hidden the body and sent baby Geraldine to the country. The police were highly skeptical of Timothy's new story. John Christie was a respected former police officer, while Timothy was a known liar and illiterate. But because a baby was involved, they rushed back to Rillington Place to search the property. They knocked on John Christie's door. John and his wife Ethel appeared completely shocked by the allegations. John denied having any knowledge of Beryl's whereabouts and insisted that Geraldine had never been in his care. The police began a thorough search of the property. When they went into the backyard, they found a small, locked wooden shed. They broke the lock and stepped inside. Under a pile of old timber and wrapped in heavy blankets, they found the bodies of Beryl Evans and 13-month-old Geraldine. Both had been brutally strangled to death with a piece of rope. The police brought Timothy back to London and showed him his daughter's clothing. Timothy, realizing his daughter was dead, was completely devastated. During a grueling interrogation, the police pressured the grieving, intellectually disabled young man. They told him that his story about Christie was ridiculous and that he was the only suspect. Confused, overwhelmed, and wanting his nightmare to end, Timothy signed a confession written by the police, admitting to strangling both his wife and his daughter. Timothy went on trial for the murder of his daughter. Throughout the trial, Timothy recanted his confession, screaming that John Christie was the real killer. But the jury did not believe him. John Christie took the stand as the star witness for the prosecution. Dressed in a neat suit, speaking in a gentle, polite whisper, he painted Timothy as a violent, unstable alcoholic who had murdered his family in a fit of rage. The jury convicted Timothy in less than 40 minutes, and he was sentenced to hang. On March 9, 1950, Timothy was escorted to the gallows at Pentonville Prison and executed. He died protesting his innocence. But the story does not end there. 3 years after Timothy's execution, John Christie fell into financial trouble and abandoned his ground-floor flat at Rillington Place. A new tenant named Beresford Brown moved into the apartment. While trying to fix up the kitchen pantry, Beresford peeled back a loose strip of wallpaper. Behind it, he saw a small wooden door leading into a hidden hollow space behind the wall. Beresford opened the door and shined a flashlight inside. What he saw made him scream in terror. Stuffed inside the tiny crawl space were the highly decomposed bodies of 3 young women. The police were called, and a massive investigation was launched. They dug up the garden and the floorboards of the apartment. They found the body of John Christie's wife, Ethel, buried under the kitchen floor. In the garden, they discovered the skeletal remains of 2 more women who had gone missing years earlier. John Christie was arrested a few days later, wandering the streets of London. Under interrogation, the polite, respected former police officer confessed to being a prolific serial killer. He admitted to murdering at least 8 women, including Beryl Evans. It turns out that John Christie was a necrophilic serial killer who got pleasure from controlling and killing women. He had lured Beryl Evans into his apartment under the false promise of an abortion. He had designed a special glass jar filled with coal gas, which contained carbon monoxide. He forced Beryl to breathe the gas through a rubber tube, rendering her unconscious. While she was passed out, he assaulted her and then strangled her. When baby Geraldine would not stop crying, he strangled her as well. He then manipulated the illiterate, trusting Timothy into running away and taking the fall for the crime, using his own reputation as a former police officer to convince the court of Timothy's guilt. John Christie was convicted of murder and hanged on July 15, 1953. The shocking revelation that the state had executed an innocent, disabled young man based on the testimony of a serial killer caused massive public outrage. It sparked a massive movement against the death penalty in the United Kingdom. In 1966, Timothy Evans was officially granted a posthumous pardon, and by 1969, the UK abolished the death penalty entirely. Now, we are going to travel to the country of Honduras, in Central America. In August of 2015, a 16-year-old girl named Ney Perez was living in a small, impoverished town called La Entrada. Despite the high rates of crime and poverty in her country, Ney was incredibly happy. She had recently married her teenage sweetheart, a boy named Rudy, and she was currently pregnant with their first child. She spent her days preparing for the arrival of her baby, surrounded by her loving family. One warm night, Ney suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. She realized she needed to use the bathroom. Since her small home did not have indoor plumbing, she climbed out of bed, carefully stepped over her relatives who were sleeping on the floor, and walked out the back door into the dark yard toward the family outhouse, but Nay never made it to the outhouse. The next morning, her mother, Maria, woke up early and looked out the back window. She saw Nay lying face down on the grass. Maria screamed and ran outside. She flipped Nay over and saw that her daughter was completely unresponsive, cold, and had white foam coming from her mouth. Because the area was extremely remote and deeply religious, Maria did not think to call a doctor or an ambulance. Instead, believing that her daughter's sudden collapse and foaming mouth were signs of demonic possession, she called the local priest. The priest rushed to the home and performed an intense exorcism on the unconscious girl, praying over her for hours. But Nay did not wake up. Finally, realizing that she was not responding, the family carried Nay to the nearest hospital. But by the time they arrived, the doctors checked her vitals and declared her dead. The doctors could not explain what had caused the healthy teenager to collapse, but they signed the death certificate. Devastated, the family brought Nay's body back home, held a brief wake, and buried her the following day. In Honduras, because of the wet ground, people are often buried in above-ground concrete tombs. Nay's coffin was slid into a hollow concrete block, and the opening was sealed shut with fresh wet cement and bricks. The day after the funeral, Rudy, Nay's young husband, was completely destroyed by grief. He had lost his beautiful young wife and his unborn child in a single night. He walked to the quiet cemetery, found Nay's concrete tomb, and leaned against it, crying hysterically. But as he put his head against the cold concrete, he heard a sound that made his heart freeze. From inside the sealed concrete tomb, he heard a faint, desperate scratching sound. And then he heard a muffled, terrified scream. It was Nay's voice, crying out for help from inside her coffin. Rudy screamed for help and began tearing at the concrete with his bare hands. Nearby cemetery workers rushed over with sledgehammers and began smashing the fresh bricks and concrete. They finally broke through the seal, pulled the wooden coffin out of the tomb, and pried open the lid. Inside, they found a horrific scene. Nay's eyes were open, and her face, hands, and forehead were covered in deep, bloody cuts. The glass viewing window of her coffin had been completely shattered, and shards of glass were stuck in her skin and mouth. It was clear that Nay had woken up inside the dark coffin, realized she was buried alive, and had spent hours frantically screaming, pounding, and kicking at the walls of her coffin in a desperate attempt to escape. Rudy touched her neck and felt a very faint, weak pulse. They loaded her into a truck and rushed her to the hospital. But when they arrived, doctors checked her again and found that she was truly dead. Her heart had stopped just minutes before they arrived. Nay had survived for over 24 hours inside the sealed tomb, only to die of suffocation just as her husband discovered she was alive. Medical experts later concluded that Nay had never been dead when she was buried. She had likely suffered from a severe episode of cataplexy, a rare condition often triggered by extreme fear or panic, which causes a person's muscles to completely freeze, their heart rate to drop to an almost undetectable level, and their breathing to become incredibly shallow. To the untrained doctors at the local hospital, she appeared dead. She had been buried alive, and the frantic struggle to escape had eventually used up all the oxygen in her coffin, causing her to suffocate. Now, we are going to travel to the state of Oregon, in the United States. In the year 2007, a young 18-year-old high school student named Matt Higgins was preparing to graduate. Like many young people his age, Matt felt incredibly stressed about his future. He did not know if he wanted to go to college, get a job, or what career path he should choose. He felt a deep desire to escape the pressure of society and find himself. That year, Matt went to the movie theater and watched the movie Into the Wild. The film, based on a true story, followed Christopher McCandless, a young man who gave away his savings, abandoned his car, and traveled into the Alaskan wilderness to live completely off the grid, free from the constraints of modern life. Although Christopher ultimately died of starvation, the movie focused on his adventurous spirit and his pursuit of pure freedom. Matt was completely inspired by the movie. He decided that he wanted to do something similar, but with a safer set end date, he decided that in the spring of 2008, after he graduated, he would hike the California section of the Pacific Crest Trail. This was a massive 1,700-mile wilderness trail that started at the Mexican border and ran north all the way to the Oregon border. Matt was not an amateur. He had grown up camping and hiking in the rugged forests of the Pacific Northwest. He knew how to pitch a tent, how to navigate using a compass, and how to handle dangerous wildlife. He packed his high-quality gear, flew to Southern California, and began his massive journey north. For the first few weeks, the hike was an incredible, peaceful experience. Matt would hike 20 to 30 miles a day, sleep under the stars, and wake up to do it again. He felt a deep sense of peace and clarity. But everything changed when he entered the Lassen National Forest in Northern California, about 150 miles from his final destination. One afternoon, Matt was hiking along a narrow, winding section of the trail. The forest here was incredibly dense, with massive pine trees packed tightly together, creating a dark, silent canopy over the trail. It felt like walking through a deep, green tunnel, As Matt rounded a sharp bend in the trail, he suddenly saw a massive gray boulder off to the right. Sitting on top of the boulder were two people, a man and a woman. What struck Matt immediately was their clothing. They were both dressed head to toe in pure white garments, but their clothes were filthy, covered in mud and pine needles. The man had a long, wild, unkempt beard, and both of them looked incredibly gaunt and pale. As Matt approached, he smiled politely, raised his hand, and said hello. But the couple did not move a muscle. They did not blink, smile, or speak. They simply stared daggers at Matt, their eyes tracking him with an intense, hostile expression as he walked past. Matt felt a cold shiver run down his spine, and he quickly hurried down the trail, refusing to look back. He walked for several more hours until the sun began to set. Because the forest was so thick, there was no flat ground near the trail to pitch his tent. Not wanting to block the trail, Matt decided to walk about 300 feet deep into the dense woods until he found a small, hidden clearing. He pitched his tent, made some dinner, and packed his remaining food into a bear-proof bag. Using a rope, Matt threw the bag over a high branch of a pine tree, tying it off so it hung 10 feet off the ground, far out of reach of any animals. He crawled into his tent, zipped the door shut, and fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, Matt woke up at dawn. He unzipped his tent and stepped outside, but he immediately noticed that his food bag was gone from the tree. The rope had been cleanly cut. Matt assumed a clever bear had somehow gotten to it. He walked over to the tree to look for animal tracks in the soft dirt. But as he looked down, he froze. There were no bear prints. Instead, there were two distinct sets of human boot prints, and as Matt looked closer, he saw that these boot prints did not just lead to the tree. They led directly to his tent, circling it multiple times, and stopping right next to where his head had been resting while he slept. Matt realized with absolute horror that the strange couple in white had followed him in the dark. They had silently navigated 300 feet into the trackless woods, cut down his food, stood inches from his sleeping face, and then vanished. Matt packed his gear in a panic, ran back to the trail, and began hiking north as fast as his legs could carry him. For the next 3 days, Matt did not see the couple. He convinced himself that they were just hungry wilderness drifters who had wanted his food and were now gone. On the fourth night, he camped deep in the woods again. But this time, as a precaution, he laid out a wide perimeter of dry, brittle sticks all around his tent, creating a natural alarm system. In the middle of the night, Matt was suddenly awakened by a sharp, cracking sound. Someone had stepped on his stick perimeter. Matt reached out and grabbed his hunting knife, his heart pounding in his chest. He lay perfectly still in the pitch-black tent. Listening, he heard slow, deliberate footsteps brushing against the nylon of his tent. Someone was standing right outside, just inches from him. And then he began to hear a quiet, frantic whispering. But the whispering was not just coming from the person outside his tent. It was coming from the dark woods all around him, echoing from different directions, as if multiple people were hiding in the trees, whispering to each other in a strange, urgent language. Matt was too terrified to move or make a sound. He lay there, clutching his knife, until the whispering and footsteps suddenly stopped. The forest became dead silent. Matt did not hear anyone walk away, meaning whoever was out there was likely still standing in the dark, waiting. Matt stayed awake until the sun came up. He crawled out of his tent and found more fresh boot prints circling his tent, but no prints leading away into the woods. He abandoned his stick perimeter, packed his bag, and ran. 2 days later, Matt reached the Mount Shasta wilderness. Mount Shasta is a beautiful, massive volcanic mountain, but it has a very dark history of bizarre, unexplained disappearances. As Matt was hiking along an open, elevated ridge with a clear view of the trail behind him, he decided to stop and look back. Miles away, on the winding trail below, he saw two tiny white specks slowly moving in his direction. It was the couple in white. They were still following him. They had tracked him for over 60 miles through the rugged wilderness. Matt did not care about finishing his hike anymore. He turned and began running down the trail toward the nearest town, Castella, which was 25 miles away. He ran for hours, pushed by pure adrenaline. When night fell and it became too dark to see, he had to stop. He scrambled hundreds of feet into the thick forest, pitched his tent, laid out another perimeter of dry sticks, and crawled inside with his knife, terrified. A few hours later, a stick snapped. Instantly, the entire clearing lit up. Someone was shining a massive, high-powered flashlight directly at his tent, illuminating the inside like a light bulb. The light stayed on for a few seconds and then clicked off, plunging the camp into pitch-black silence. Matt's survival instinct took over. He ripped open his tent zipper, jumped outside, and began screaming and swinging his hunting knife in the dark, trying to scare them off. He heard a branch snap right behind him. He whipped his head around and saw a tall, dark silhouette rushing toward him from the trees. Matt turned and bolted into the dark forest. He ran blindly, crashing into tree trunks, branches scratching his face, and falling over rocks. After several minutes of running, he tripped and fell next to a large, fallen log. He crawled into a small, hollow space under the log and lay flat in the dirt, holding his breath. In the distance, he saw the beam of a flashlight bobbing through the trees. He watched in absolute terror as the light moved closer and closer. He could hear the quiet, urgent whispering of the couple as they searched the bushes for him. They walked right past the fallen log, the beam of their light passing inches from his face, but they did not see him. Matt stayed hidden under the log, freezing and terrified for the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose, the forest was quiet. Matt crawled out, abandoned his expensive backpack, tent, and gear, and ran to the main road. He hitchhiked to the nearest town and reported the terrifying encounter to the police. Although the police searched the area and found Matt's abandoned campsite, they found no trace of the mysterious couple in white. To this day, Matt has no idea who those people were, why they targeted him, or how they were able to track him silently through the dark wilderness for nearly 100 miles. It remains one of the most terrifying mysteries of the Pacific Crest Trail. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya!